The gold foil invitation was meant to be a final, cruel dagger to her heart. David Castiglione, the ruthless head of the New York syndicate, wanted his exiled ex-wife to watch him marry his new queen. Instead, Flora walked through the grand ballroom doors holding the hands of two miniature, icy blue-eyed copies of him. The morning of the wedding smelt of sea salt, expensive orchids, and impending power. David Castiglione stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirrors of his Hamptons estate, methodically adjusting the diamond cufflinks of his bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo. At 34, David was the undisputed king of the Eastern Seaboard's underworld. He was a man crafted from cold ambition and inherited brutality, possessing a face that belonged on a Roman coin and a heart that had seemingly stopped beating 5 years ago. The perimeter is secure, boss. The Romano family has arrived, and Don Romano is already drinking your best scotch in the parlor. David didn't look away from his reflection. He met the eyes of his underboss, Silvio, through the glass. Let the old man drink. Today's the day he finally gets what he's been scheming for since I took over the family. Today, David was marrying Isabella Romano. It was the Mafia wedding of the decade, a blood-bound merger between the Castiglione shipping empire and the Romano political machine. It was perfect. It was strategic. It was entirely devoid of love. But David's mind wasn't on Isabella's flawless porcelain features or the massive dowry of territory her father was handing over. His mind was focused on a single, thick envelope he had mailed out 6 weeks prior. Flora Hayes. Just thinking her name caused a familiar, dark knot to tighten in his chest. Flora, the civilian. The kindergarten teacher he had recklessly fallen in love with and married in a secret ceremony in Sicily, much to the disgust of his family. For 2 years, she had been his light, the only soft thing in his violent world, until the day she wasn't. 5 years ago, David's empire had almost crumbled. Federal agents had raided 3 of his warehouses, and millions of dollars had been inexplicably wired from his private offshore accounts to the rival Falcone syndicate. The digital trail, carefully and undeniably, pointed directly to Flora's personal laptop. Isabella's father, Don Romano, had been the one to present the evidence to David. Blinded by betrayal and the absolute law of the Mafia code, David had turned into a monster. He hadn't let Flora speak. He hadn't listened to her tears or her desperate pleas of innocence. In the pouring rain of a bitter November night, he had stripped her of her wedding ring, her dignity, and her protection, throwing her out onto the streets of New York with nothing but the clothes on her back. He had promised her that if she ever showed her face in his city again, he would put a bullet in her himself. He had expected her to crawl. He had expected her to beg, but Flora had simply vanished. "Did she RSVP?" David asked, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. Silvio shifted uncomfortably. He knew exactly who David was talking about. No, boss. Arthur, the private investigator, confirmed the invitation was delivered to the P.O. box in Seattle. But there's been no word. She's not going to show. It would be suicide. David's jaw ticked. She should see it. She should see what happens to traitors. She should see me take a real Mafia bride, a woman who actually understands loyalty. It was a lie, and Silvio knew it. David had sent that invitation out of pure, venomous spite. He wanted to break whatever was left of Flora. He wanted her to sit in the back pew of the church, a broken, impoverished spectator to his grand triumph. He wanted to look down the aisle and see regret in her eyes. "Isabella is waiting," Silvio reminded him gently. David finally turned away from the mirror. He grabbed his tailored jacket and slid it on, his posture rigid. "Let's go get married, then. Put extra men on the doors. If by some miracle my ex-wife decides to show her face, I want her escorted directly to a VIP table, right where I can see her." Hours later, the vows had been spoken, the rings exchanged, and the blood pact sealed before 500 of the most powerful and dangerous people in the country. Isabella stood by his side, draped in a $500,000 lace gown, smiling flawlessly for the flashing cameras of the private press. She was triumphant. She had finally won the prize she had coveted since she was a teenager. The reception shifted to the grand ballroom of the Castiglione estate. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars bathed the room in golden light. Waiters in white tuxedos circulated with trays of Dom Perignon. Senators, judges, and capos rubbed elbows, laughing over the string quartet playing softly in the corner. David sat at the center of the head table, sipping his whiskey. His eyes, dark and predatory, constantly scanned the room. The mahogany double doors at the entrance remained firmly shut. She didn't come, he thought, a bitter taste rising in his throat. She's too much of a coward. Isabella leaned over, pressing her perfectly painted red lips to his cheek. You seem distracted, my king. Looking for someone? She purred, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She knew about the invitation. She had laughed when he sent it. No one important, David replied coldly, pulling slightly away from her touch. Good, because tonight is about us, the Romano and Castiglione families, united. No more weak links, no more pathetic little civilians dragging you down. David's grip on his heavy crystal tumbler tightened until his knuckles turned bone white. Before he could snap a harsh reply, a sudden, heavy silence swept through the back of the ballroom. It didn't happen all at once. It was a ripple effect. First, the private security guards near the entrance stiffened, stepping back with wide eyes. Then, Senator Gallagher, mid-laugh, froze and stared. Don Romano dropped his cigar. The whispers began, starting as a low hiss and escalating into a frantic, electric hum that drowned out the string quartet. The heavy mahogany doors had been opened. David slowly set his glass down. He looked up, peering through the sea of Armani suits and diamond-draped women. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, shrinking back as if a ghost had just walked into the room. And in a way, Flora Hayes did not look like a broken woman. She did not look like the weeping, terrified girl David had cast out into the freezing rain 5 years ago. She stood at the top of the Grand Foyer's marble staircase, looking down at the empire that had chewed her up and spat her out. She was wearing an emerald green silk gown that clung to her curves, a dress that screamed quiet, devastating wealth. Her dark auburn hair was swept over one shoulder in cascading waves, and a simple, stunning teardrop emerald rested at the hollow of her throat. She looked ethereal. She looked lethal. But it wasn't Flora's breathtaking transformation that had paralyzed the room. It wasn't the two massive, heavily armed private security contractors standing stoically behind her. It was the children. Flora's hands were firmly holding the hands of two little boys. They looked to be about 4 years old. They were dressed in miniature, flawlessly tailored black tuxedos that mirrored the exact style David was wearing. David stood up. The movement was so abrupt, his heavy carved chair scraped violently against the marble floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The boys stepped forward into the light of the chandeliers. The collective gasp from the room was audible. The children were carbon copies of the man standing at the head table. They had the same aristocratic, sharp jawlines. They had the same thick, unruly raven hair. But most damning of all were their eyes. They possessed the exact, striking, icy blue Castiglione eyes, a genetic trait so dominant and specific it was legendary in the New York underworld. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. The math hit David with the force of a speeding freight train. The breath vanished from his lungs. The room spun, the glittering lights blurring into a smeared streak of gold. 5 years ago, the weeks before he threw her out, she had been tired, she had been sick in the mornings, he had been too blinded by paranoia and mafia politics to notice the signs. She was pregnant. He had thrown his pregnant wife out into the streets to die. What is the meaning of this? Don Romano roared, shattering the silence. The old mafia boss stood up, his face purple with sudden, terrified rage. Guards! Throw this trash out. How did she get past the gate? She got past the gate because her name is on the guest list, Don Romano. Flora's voice rang out. It was a voice David didn't recognize. Gone was the soft, eager-to-please tone. This voice was tempered steel. It carried effortlessly across the silent ballroom. Flora began to descend the stairs, her heels clicking softly against the marble. The twins walked perfectly in step with her, their small faces observing the crowd with an eerie, quiet intelligence that mirrored their father's completely. Isabella shot up from her seat, her face pale, her hands trembling. David! She hissed, grabbing his arm. David, do something! Have her killed! This is a trick! David didn't hear her. He couldn't feel her hand on his arm. His entire universe had narrowed down to the two little boys walking toward him, his blood, his heirs. Walking into a room full of wolves. Stand down, David choked out, raising a single hand. The Castiglione soldiers, who had drawn their weapons at Romano's order, immediately froze, lowering their guns. Flora stopped 20 feet away from the head table. The space between them felt like a battlefield. She looked directly into David's eyes, and he saw nothing but cold, absolute indifference. There was no love left in her. He had killed it. "Hello, David," Flora said smoothly. "I received your invitation. It was a bit tacky, sending it via regular mail, but I appreciate the thought. I figured it would be rude not to congratulate you in person." David's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked at the boy on the left, who was glaring at him with a stubborn pout, and then at the boy on the right, who was watching him with cold curiosity. "Are these—" David's voice cracked. The feared Don of New York sounded like a breathless child. "Are they yours?" Flora finished for him, a mocking smile playing on her lips. "Don't flatter yourself. Biologically? Perhaps. But a father is a man who protects his family. You're just the sperm donor who threw us away." The insult, delivered so publicly, should have earned her a death sentence. Any other capo would have shot her where she stood for the disrespect. But the men in the room just watched in stunned silence, looking back and forth between David and the miniature copies of him. "Flora," David whispered, stepping out from behind the table. He ignored Isabella's frantic tugging on his jacket. He took a step toward them. Instantly, the two massive security guards stepped in front of Flora, their hands resting menacingly on the butts of the weapons concealed beneath their jackets. "Ah, Flora tutted softly. "No closer, David. We aren't here for a family reunion. We are just here to deliver a wedding gift." She let go of the right twin's hand. The boy Leo reached into his tiny tuxedo pocket and pulled out a sleek, black USB drive. He walked forward bravely, his little leather shoes tapping on the marble, and placed it on the nearest empty cocktail table. He then jogged back to his mother, taking her hand again. "What is that?" David asked, unable to take his eyes off the boy. "The truth," Flora said, her voice dropping an octave, echoing with a dangerous promise. 5 years ago, you convicted me without a trial. You believed a fabricated ledger over the word of your own wife. I spent the last 5 years building my own empire, David. And I spent a lot of money hiring the best cyber mercenaries in the world to trace those offshore accounts." Isabella gasped loudly, stumbling back. Don Romano's face drained of all color, turning a sickly ashen gray. Flora's eyes flicked to the bride, her smile turning vicious. "Congratulations, Isabella. I hope you enjoy your marriage." Because on that drive is the undeniable, cryptographically verified proof that your father was the one who wired the money to the Falcone family. He framed me to clear the path for you to marry the Don. Chaos erupted in the ballroom. Men began shouting. The Romano soldiers instinctively reached for their pieces, but they were hopelessly outnumbered by Castiglione men, who were now looking at their boss for orders. David stood frozen, staring at the small black drive resting on the cocktail table. The gravity of what Flora had just revealed was suffocating. If it were true, and looking at the sheer terror on Isabella's and Don Romano's faces, he knew he had destroyed the only woman he ever loved over a lie. He had missed the birth of his sons. He had missed their first steps, their first words. He had done it all for a treacherous alliance with the rats who had orchestrated the whole thing. "Mummy," the twin named Luca suddenly spoke up. His voice was small, but in the tense silence of the room, it carried perfectly. He pointed a tiny finger directly at David. "Is that the bad man who made you cry?" Flora looked down at her son, her expression softening into pure maternal love. She gently stroked his dark hair. "Yes, baby, that's him." She looked back up at David, her eyes hardening into shards of green glass. "But he can never hurt us again. We're leaving now." "Flora, wait," David begged, taking a frantic step forward, the Mafia boss facade entirely stripped away. "You can't just leave. The boys, they're Castigliones. They belong here. With me." Flora let out a short, hollow laugh that sent shivers down Silvio's spine. "They belong to me, David. You gave up all rights to us the night you left me in the gutter. Enjoy your wedding night. I hear betrayal makes for a very cold bed." With a final, dismissive glance at the shattered Don, Flora turned on her heel. The twins followed, flanked by their security. The crowd parted for them once again, no one daring to breathe, let alone stop them. David watched the heavy mahogany doors swing shut behind them, taking his entire world away for the second time. He stood in the center of his opulent, golden ballroom, surrounded by power, wealth, and his new bride. And for the first time in his life, David Castiglione felt completely and utterly destroyed. The heavy mahogany doors shutting behind Flora felt like the lid of a coffin slamming down on David's life. For a full 10 seconds, the grand ballroom of the Hamptons estate was a tomb. No one breathed. No one moved. The string quartet had long since abandoned their instruments, shrinking into the shadows. David didn't look at Isabella, who was weeping hysterically, her designer mascara running down her porcelain cheeks. He didn't look at Don Romano, who was sweating profusely, his eyes darting toward the exits. David's gaze was locked entirely on the small, unassuming black USB drive resting on the cocktail table. Silvio. David's voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the silence like a scalpel. Bring me a laptop. Now. David! Please! Isabella shrieked, lunging forward to grab his tuxedo jacket. It's a lie! That bitch is lying! She's just trying to ruin our day! David moved with a terrifying, fluid suddenness. He didn't strike her, he had never struck a woman, but he seized her wrist with a grip that bruised bone, peeling her fingers off his lapel. He looked at her with eyes so devoid of humanity that Isabella's screams hitched in her throat, turning into a pathetic whimper. If you speak again before I have looked at this drive, David said, his tone dead flat, I will have Silvio cut your tongue out and serve it at the reception. He dropped her wrist. Isabella collapsed into a chair, sobbing silently into her hands. Within 90 seconds, Silvio had procured a secure, air-gapped laptop from the estate's security office. He placed it on the main dining table, sweeping aside a towering centerpiece of white orchids to make room. David sat down. The crowd of 500 elite guests remained entirely frozen, hostages to the unfolding drama. David inserted the drive. A single folder appeared on the screen, labeled Castiglione, Falcone, routing. David opened it. Inside were dozens of PDF files, bank statements, and, most devastatingly, a series of encrypted audio files. David clicked the first audio file. He turned the laptop's volume to maximum. Static hissed through the ballroom speakers, followed by the unmistakable, gravelly voice of Don Romano. The girl is a civilian, an innocent. It's too easy, Falcone. We route the 3 million through her personal accounts, bounce it through the Caymans, and drop it in your lap. David is too blinded by his own paranoia. When I show him the digital footprint, he won't ask questions. He'll get rid of her. Another voice, smooth and chilling, Carlo Falcone, David's sworn enemy. And in return, the Romano family gets the Castiglione shipping routes? No. Romano chuckled darkly on the recording. In return, my daughter gets the Castiglione crown. Once the kindergarten teacher is out of the picture, I'll console the grieving Don. A year, maybe 2, and Isabella will be wearing his ring. We take the empire from the inside. The recording clicked off. The silence that followed was suffocating. The air in the room grew cold, thick with the promise of absolute violence. David slowly closed the laptop. He stood up. He methodically unbuttoned his tuxedo jacket and handed it to Silvio. He then rolled up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt, revealing the intricate, dark tattoos winding up his forearms. Don Romano drew his weapon, a desperate, frantic move. It's a deep fake, the old man bellowed, his hand shaking wildly. AI! That bitch faked the audio! David didn't even flinch. Before Romano could raise the barrel, 3 of David's top enforcers had their guns pressed directly to the back of the old Don's skull. Take him to the soundproof basement, David ordered, his voice echoing with finality. Take the bride with him, lock down the estate. Any Romano soldier who reaches for his piece dies on the spot. This wedding is annulled. As the screaming Romanos were dragged away, kicking and pleading, David turned to look at the mahogany doors. Flora was gone. His sons were gone. Silvio, David said, his chest heaving as the adrenaline and heartbreak finally crashed into him. Get Harrison on the line. I want every camera at the airports, train stations, and highways scoured. Find out where she went. I don't care what it costs. It took Harrison, David's lead cyber analyst, less than 48 hours to find her. Flora hadn't exactly hidden. She had simply insulated herself in a world David couldn't easily touch. Boss, Harrison said, standing in David's dimly lit New York office 2 days later. She's not hiding in the shadows. She's in Medina, Washington, right outside Seattle. Medina? David frowned. That's where the tech billionaires live. Bill Gates, Bezos. How can she afford to live there? Harrison swallowed hard. 'Cause she's one of them now, boss. After she left, she used her knowledge of our encrypted networks to build a cybersecurity architecture. She founded a company called Aegis Cypher. She sells untraceable, impenetrable communication networks to foreign governments, private military contractors, and legitimate Fortune 500 companies. Her net worth is estimated at over $900 million. David sank into his leather chair, staring blankly at the wall. The woman he had left with nothing but the clothes on her back had built an empire that rivaled his own. And her security? David asked. Impenetrable, Harrison replied grimly. Her head of security is a man named Declan Reed, ex-British SAS. Her estate is a fortress. Biometric locks, armed drones, 24-hour private military guard. You can't just kick her door down, boss. It would start a literal war. Book the jet, David said, standing up. His icy blue eyes hardened with desperate resolve. I don't care if she has an army. Those are my sons. I'm going to Seattle. The Medina estate was a sprawling masterpiece of modern architecture, all glass, steel, and dark wood, perched aggressively on the edge of Lake Washington. It looked less like a home and more like a high-tech compound. David stood at the reinforced titanium front gate, the relentless Seattle rain soaking through his black cashmere overcoat. He had come with only Silvio and 2 trusted men, knowing an army would only provoke Flora's defenses. State your business, a mechanical voice buzzed through the intercom. David Castiglione, he said to the camera mounted above, tell Flora I'm not leaving until I see her. For 5 agonizing minutes, nothing happened. The rain beat down. Then, with a heavy, hydraulic hiss, the massive gate swung open. A towering man in a tactical suit, Declan Reed was waiting on the front steps. His hand rested casually near his holstered weapon. Mr. Castiglione, Declan said in a crisp British accent. Miss Hayes will see you. Your men wait here. Any sudden movements inside, and I put a hollow point through your kneecap. Understood? David glared at the man, but nodded. He stepped inside. The interior of the house was stunning, yet entirely devoid of the cold, Mafia opulence David was used to. It was filled with light, modern art, and the distinct, chaotic warmth of children. Toys were scattered in the hallway. Framed finger paintings hung next to priceless modern canvases. It was a home. A home he had zero part in building. Declan escorted him to a massive office overlooking the lake. Flora sat behind a sleek black walnut desk, typing on a holographic monitor. She didn't look up when he entered. She was wearing a simple, cream-colored cashmere sweater and slacks, her hair tied in a messy knot. She looked incredibly beautiful and completely out of his reach. You have 5 minutes, David Flora said, finally raising her eyes. They were as cold and unforgiving as the Seattle rain outside, and only because I knew you'd camp on my lawn like a stray dog until I let you in. Flora, David started taking a step forward. Declan instantly moved to block him. David stopped, raising his hands. I didn't know. I swear on my life, I didn't know you were pregnant. And if you had? Flora shot back, her voice dripping with venom. Would you have thrown me out gently? Put me in a nicer cab before exiling me? You still believed I was a traitor? You still chose the word of a snake over your own wife? I was blind, David confessed, his voice breaking. The ruthless Don of New York was practically begging. Romano, the evidence was flawless. It was a setup. I killed him, Flora. I ended the Romanos. I avenged what they did to you. Flora let out a bitter, exhausted sigh. Do you think I care about Mafia vengeance, David? I don't care that Romano is dead. It doesn't give me back the nights I spent sleeping in a bus terminal, terrified I was going to lose the babies. It doesn't erase the days I worked 3 waitress jobs just to afford prenatal vitamins. I saved myself. I built this. You don't get to walk back in just because you finally figured out you were an idiot. They are my sons, David said, his jaw tightening. They have Castiglione blood. They have my blood, Flora countered fiercely, standing up. They are Hayes. They will never touch your world. They will never hold a gun. They will never extort, and they will never throw someone they love out into the cold. Before David could reply, the office door clicked open. Mommy? David froze. He turned slowly. Leo and Luca stood in the doorway, wearing matching dinosaur pajamas. They rubbed their eyes, looking between their mother and the tall, dark stranger in the wet coat. David's heart shattered and rebuilt itself in the span of a single heartbeat. Up close, the resemblance was even more staggering. Looking at them was like looking into a time machine. Boys, Flora said, her voice instantly dropping its hostility, replaced by a warm, protective panic. I told you to stay with Mrs. Higgins. We wanted a glass of water, Luca said, stepping further into the room. His icy blue eyes locked onto David. He tilted his head, studying him with unnerving focus. You're the man from the party, the bad man. David dropped to one knee, ignoring Declan's sudden shift in posture. He needed to be at their eye level. I'm not a bad man, David rasped, tears prickling the corners of his eyes. I made a terrible mistake. A long time ago. But I am your... He choked on the word. He felt he hadn't earned the right to say it. Are you our dad? Leo asked bluntly. The boy had David's exact scowl. Mommy says our dad was a mobster who lived in a dirty city and made bad choices. David let out a wet, breathless laugh. Your mother is a very honest woman. Yes. I'm your father. The twins looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them that only twins could understand. Then, Leo looked back at David. Do you have a gun? Leo, that's enough, Flora warned, stepping out from behind her desk. But before she could reach the boys, the serene quiet of the lakeside estate was shattered. A piercing, high-decibel alarm ripped through the house, flashing the ambient lighting, a stark, warning crimson. Declan immediately drew his weapon, his earpiece buzzing frantically. Miss Hayes! Perimeter breach! Heavily armed hostiles, eastern flank. They blew through the outer gate with C4. Flora's face went pale, but her training kicked in. She scooped the twins into her arms, rushing toward a concealed panic room door behind her bookshelf. Who is it? Corporate espionage? No, Declan barked, checking a tablet on his wrist. Tactical gear. Unmarked. There are 20 of them. David stood up, the emotional vulnerability vanishing instantly, replaced by the lethal, calculating predator that ruled the East Coast. He recognized the tactics. He recognized the brazenness of a C4 strike. It's Falcone, David said, his voice deadly calm as he drew his own heavy Glock 19 from his shoulder holster. Flora stopped at the panic room door, staring at him. Falcone? Why are they here? Because you humiliated the Romanos, and I wiped them out, David said, racking the slide of his pistol. There's a power vacuum in New York. Falcone knows I'm out of my territory, exposed. He tracked me here. He wants to kill me, and he wants to kill my heirs to end the Castiglione line forever. Gunfire erupted from the floor below, the heavy thud of assault rifles echoing up the grand staircase. Get the boys in the room, David ordered, moving toward the office door to cover the hallway. David, you only have 3 men out there, Flora yelled over the alarms. You can't hold them off. David glanced back at her. He looked at the woman he had wronged, and the 2 tiny, terrified faces burying themselves into her neck. This was his reckoning. This was his chance to finally be the shield he had failed to be 5 years ago. I'm not leaving you to the wolves again, Flora, David said softly, the gunfire drawing closer. Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me. With that, the Don of New York stepped out into the crimson-lit hallway, ready to wage war for the family he had just found. The crimson emergency light strobed across the sleek, minimalist hallway, casting long, bloody shadows against the modern art. David pressed his back against the cold steel of the doorframe, his Glock 19 raised. The smell of cordite and shattered drywall already choked the air. Beside him, Declan Reed expertly checked the magazine of his customized SIG MCX assault rifle. The ex-SAS mercenary didn't look at the Mafia boss with respect, but rather a cold, professional understanding. They were dead men walking if they didn't hold the choke point. 3 men on the stairs, 2 flanking through the atrium, Declan muttered, peering through a shattered glass balustrade. Before David could reply, a deafening explosion rocked the floorboards. The Falcone Syndicate wasn't here to negotiate. They had brought heavy breaching charges. Suddenly, Flora's voice echoed through the hallway, piped in through the estate's hidden PA system. It didn't tremble. It was the voice of a CEO who commanded $1 billion tech empire. David, Declan. Earpieces on the floor, now, she commanded. Declan kicked a spare tactical earpiece across the hardwood. David scooped it up and jammed it into his ear. They cut the main grid, but my localized servers are isolated. Flora's voice spoke directly into his ear, calm and chillingly precise. I have full thermal imaging from the panic room. I'm dropping the interior blast shutters in Sector 4. It's going to funnel them right to you. When the lights go pitch black, drop to the floor. Copy that. Boss, Declan said. David smirked, wiping a streak of dust from his face. His wife was brilliant. Heavy combat boots pounded up the floating glass staircase. Falcone's hitmen, dressed in unmarked black tactical gear, swept onto the second-floor landing. Now, Flora ordered. The crimson emergency lights abruptly cut out, plunging the entire floor into absolute suffocating darkness. Simultaneously, massive titanium shutters slammed down across the floor-to-ceiling windows, sealing the upper level like a tomb. David and Declan dropped flat. A second later, a high-frequency, weaponized sonic deterrent shrieked from the ceiling speakers. It was a sound designed to rupture eardrums and disrupt equilibrium. The Falcone mercenaries screamed, dropping their weapons and clutching their heads in agony. "Take them," Flora whispered. Declan's rifle barked, the muzzle flash illuminating the dark hallway like lightning. He dropped two men with ruthless efficiency. David moved with the predatory grace of a man raised in street wars. He stepped out from the cover, his Glock firing twice in rapid succession. Two more mercenaries hit the floor. But Carlo Falcone hadn't just sent foot soldiers. He had sent his top enforcer, a scarred, towering sociopath named Silas. Silas had anticipated the trap. Wearing noise-canceling tactical headphones and night vision goggles, he bypassed the crossfire, launching himself over the railing and rolling directly into the hallway leading to the panic room. David saw the silhouette moving in the dark just as the sonic alarm ceased. "Declan, hold the stairs!" David roared, sprinting down the corridor after the enforcer. Silas reached the concealed titanium door of the panic room, pulling a block of C4 from his tactical vest. If he blew the lock, the concussive force alone would kill Flora and the twins inside. David didn't hesitate. He tackled the massive enforcer from behind. The two men crashed into the hardwood, the C4 sliding across the floor. Silas was 50 pounds heavier and trained in brutal hand-to-hand combat. He rolled, driving a knee into David's ribs with a sickening crack. David gasped, the air leaving his lungs, but he refused to let go. He grabbed Silas by the tactical vest, driving his forehead into the bridge of the enforcer's nose. Blood sprayed in the darkness. Silas snarled, pulling a serrated combat knife from his belt. He drove it downward. David twisted violently, but the blade caught him in the left shoulder, sinking deep into the muscle. Pain flared like white-hot fire, but David Castiglione had survived worse. Driven by a primal, desperate need to protect the bloodline beating behind the steel door, he gripped Silas's wrist with his right hand, snapping the joint backward with a loud pop. As the knife fell, David unholstered his Glock and fired point-blank into the enforcer's chest. Silas slumped backward, dead, before he hit the ground. Silence descended on the hallway, broken only by the distant, wailing sirens of the Seattle SWAT teams and FBI counterterrorism unit. Flora's automated systems had bypassed local police and triggered a federal response. The remaining Falcone men outside were already scattering. David collapsed against the wall, clutching his bleeding shoulder. He was breathing heavily, his bespoke shirt ruined, his body battered. A heavy, hydraulic hiss filled the corridor. The titanium door slid open. Flora stood in the doorway, the ambient light from the panic room framing her. She looked down at the dead mercenary, and then at the ruthless Mafia Don who was bleeding out on her floor to keep her safe. "You're an idiot," Flora whispered, though her voice wavered with a complex mixture of anger, shock, and an undeniable, buried affection. David looked up, offering a weak, blood-stained smile. "I told you, I'm not leaving you to the wolves again." Flora knelt beside him, pressing a clean cloth from the panic room's medical kit hard against his wound. She didn't forgive him. The 5 years of betrayal couldn't be erased by one gunfight. But as Luca and Leo peeked their heads around their mother's waist, looking at the man who had fought the monsters away, a silent truce was forged in the blood on the floor. The gold foil invitation that was meant to break Flora instead shattered David's empire of lies. He didn't win his wife back overnight, nor did he erase the years of pain. But as he sat bleeding on the floor, watching his sons peek through the steel door, the ruthless Don of New York finally understood true power. It wasn't about ruling a city, it was about protecting your blood.